You're still with us. Here we go. This is going to be fast. So I want to turn our attention to some folks who've largely been absent from our network. You'll see that one principal showed up in our year 3 network diagram. But the question for me is not the interesting of whether or not the principals belong there, but the fact that they have so much power to influence the actual work of the network. And so I'm going to look at the context of the reform work and the principal's interaction with that. My name is Christine Chu. We're going to investigate some of my research on the positive and not so positive patterns of the principal's participation. So the research questions, we discussed, we've got these studio days at every single school. We have cross-network convenings, coaches and researchers cross-populating, and yet the reform looked so different at every school, the engagement. Why? So what I wanted to ask was, what about the principals? How might the way they make sense of things and their practices be influencing the way teachers take up and push forward the reform enactments? So the context is just what I described and what Jessica showed you, but in year 3, we added some specific work. Specifically, I wanted to bring the principals in, and so I did some learning walks with 18 principals and assistant principals. We did one really big learning walk, went and talked pre and post, and then in the spring, we did a really intensive discussion asking the principals about their expectations, sharing what had happened with the network, etc. So give it the whole shebang. Now I'm trying to put together where the leadership and instructional practices intersect and their contexts. So I needed to put together a conceptual model to do that, and I grounded that starting with leadership practices, and I used Leithwitz's practices, 16 practices that are associated with learning, set into 4 categories. But beyond that, we know from Fullen's work that coherence is a really important piece. So I needed to see how those different practices were lining up with themselves, with each other, and with the reform. And then I had to figure out, well, how are principals making sense and connecting to that? And the place I mostly did that looking was in their co-participation with the reform or in reacting to and talking about the reform work at their schools. And of course, the instructional space I looked at was the ambitious science teaching practices that this whole thing is grounded in. But the place that I really wanted to look at is what is making the tighter or looser coupling between these two spaces? Because we know from Elmore and folks like that for Cuban for years, that loose coupling is part of why we're not kind of connecting the dots. So that's what I looked at. The data sources were many. We had interviews, surveys. I'm not going to spend time on this. Learning walks, observations, logs, notes from 4 years of work. And then we tried to put all that together. So I formed an instructional picture of what's happening in each of the schools. But in addition to that, I took all these different data sources and kind of formed these convergent miniature narratives that talked about little spaces in each school where the instructional the instructional and the leadership practices intersected. And that's where this work comes from. We're going to look at 2 examples today. Suffice it to say, demographics in the 2 schools are pretty similar. They had a transition from year 1 to year 2 in both schools for principal. And one's a high school, one's a middle school, but there was nothing in this study to indicate that there was a significant difference because of that. These schools I chose because they represent 2 extremes. One where the teachers were deeply engaged in the reform enactments, and another where they were much less so. And what I can tell you is one observation was in the observations outside of the studio days. When looking at these teachers, the frequency with which we observed them actually engaged in the focal practice they had chosen for the year, 10% of the time at one school, 90% of the time at the other. When we scored, both during studio days and in other observation times, what's the teacher's general proficiency with the ambitious science teaching practices? Over a point of difference on a 5-point scale of their proficiency with the practices, different levels of collaboration, different level of focus, and the principal, assistant principal were frequently attending and participating in the work at one school and dropping by and not participating at the other school. So what does that translate to? So first I wanted to look at the practice of setting direction. So how well aligned are the various priorities, instructional priorities of the school with each other and with the reform? So here's what I found at Washington High School. The principal thought their biggest focus was the writing initiative, the Assistant principal thought it was the standards-based grading. The teachers and the principal listed more and more instructional initiatives, from student voice to whatever to backwards. There were more than this. But the point is, not only were there a whole set of priorities, they didn't even connect to one another. They weren't reconciled or joined together. And they did mention the science reform, but it wasn't even in the box of priorities. In fact, the assistant principal was like, we're not really focused enough on instruction, we need to spend more time on it. So then, take that away, what happened at Douglas Middle School? Well, one priority agreed on by both administrators. We're doing standards-based instruction, we're looking at clear learning targets, and each of the things they added, even the evaluation framework, was about supporting learning targets, the rubrics to support that, shared language. And this one's really important. We want each of our departments to use data to see how we're doing towards this work and then adjust their work accordingly. So the science department used their cycles of improvement and were able to support the data work, shared instructional vision across the teachers. The writing initiative, which I'll talk about next, was also in there, but still kind of aligned. So they had some additional priorities, but they were aligned. Hyper-focus was what the vice principal said in year 3. In year 1, the principal said, we can't do all this in isolation. We can't have studio days and then not support it. We've got to put this all together. So what I've looked at next, and we're not going to have time to talk too much about it, is 4 is the alignment of the priorities with one another. How about the other practices? So both schools happen to be, by chance, engaged in a cross-school writing initiative. So put this stuff together and try to make sure, try to get everyone engaged. So at one school, the high school, they said, you know what, we'll get a bunch of teachers from each department. They sent someone from the science department who wasn't really proficient at the science practices, but they sent them and put together a rubric, and we'll use it in all the classes and what's common about the grading. So that was fine. That's what they did. And it morphed the science work. They said, well, fix your science rubric. Grade with this one. Don't worry about the specific nuances. At the other school, they went and said, you know what, we're going to start with social studies. We're going to see what's specific to writing, and then we're going to bring in the things from other pieces that are coming in. So we brought in things like the inquiry work, the questioning, and the principal wanted to take that into account for the writing process from all the science work that was being done. And they brought the leadership up. So in short, we're not going to go through it here, but from practices like communicating direction, buffering from distractions, it didn't matter. They were lining up at one school, they were just independent. So it mirrored the same sort of disbursement with the arrows and so forth that we saw. And what I found was, when you put it all together, it wasn't just that I could put categories of disconnected, loosely aligned, and integrated, and label those for the practice alignment. We could also align the principal's participation with that same thing. For the disconnected group, the principals would observe the professional learning, but they wouldn't participate in it, and they looked for the reform to shift and suit the needs of the school's greater goals. In the loosely aligned, they had multiple priorities and all that, but the science reform referenced, but at a general level, not the practices. And the principals were curious about it, and they wanted to learn about it, but they didn't use it to leverage towards their larger goals or to adjust their larger goals. In the integrated, they leveraged it on full. They participated in the learning activities, the science stuff, and they leveraged the work in what they were doing. In conclusion, really, the sweet spot in seeming to bring these two leadership and instructional practices together was this co-participation in instructional activities. And so that kind of makes you think, why, right? Like, it's not just a matter of the participation. That wasn't necessarily causing it, but it seemed to enable the principals to do a lot more to both leverage the work and to make sure that their larger goals incorporated it. So what does that mean for us? In reform partnerships, it's good that if you can have a clear role for the principal, if you can help them to make connections to their broader priorities, and identify specific structures and practices that they can do to further support it. Like your teachers may need co-planning time, or whatever those things are outside of the studio days, outside of the partnership work. And then for the research and leadership development, we really need to do a better job defining coherence, not with respect to just the overall school plan, but with respect to the discipline-specific instructional practices that we're caring about the teachers doing. And we need to identify practices that both directly and maybe indirectly are building stronger instructional coherence, like the participation. So I think I'll give it to Jessica to wrap up from there.